But we do need to be aware that we're on land that belonged to the Duwamish people. More, Mike. So today I am introducing Henry Matthews, architectural historian, and you're going to have the treat of hearing about his specialty, you still can't hear me, Kirtland Cutter, which he has written the only book on, I believe. Henry, is that correct?
No one else would dare.
And then we'll hear after about Julia Morgan, who was his contemporary. Okay, Henry, you're on.
Well, I might begin by telling you how I got involved with Kirtland Cutter. Grant pointed out last week that he was educated in architecture as a modernist, and he was very perturbed at first by the World's Columbian Exposition, but has grown to enjoy it. Well, I was also educated as a modernist and found myself writing about the most eclectic architect you could imagine. We had a morality when I was educated that we knew what era we lived in and what was appropriate to build. And as Frank Lloyd Wright said, the styles are a lie. Maybe somebody else said it, I'm not sure. But the styles are a lie. But what fun people had with those lies. And I suddenly found myself writing a book on this architect who designed every style under the sun most promiscuously. Well, I received a phone call from a film producer at Spokane who said they were making a movie about Kirtland Cutter, and could I be their advisor? Was I an expert on Kirtland Cutter? And of course I said yes. And I rushed up to Spokane and looked at the museum and discovered that they'd just found practically all his architectural drawings, which had been in a great box in somebody's coal cellar for years and years. And they were very excited with them. And so I quickly looked at a few drawings, and then there was a meeting of the Society of Architecture Historians, and I hadn't applied to give a talk. And then I thought, oh, I'm now an expert on Kirtland Cutter, so I'll give a talk on him. And I told them that I was going to be in a movie about him, so they believed me. And I went to Spokane, and I discovered that he was practically a folk hero in Spokane, because all the rich people had houses by Kirtland Cutter, and then he built buildings like the Davenport Hotel and the Spokane Club, many other buildings around the city. So I had to change my mind and think that all these styles were worth playing with, and my goodness, what fun he had. So here he is, a young man, as he was when he arrived in Spokane. And on the right, we see him outside his great-grandfather's house. He lived with his great-grandfather up to the time when he was 19. And his great-grandfather had ridden out from Connecticut and settled in New Connecticut, as it was called, later on Ohio, and had become a very distinguished physician, lawman, representative in the... His grandfather has the beard. And so his grandfather was a great naturalist and introduced him to nature. And then he went off to study at the Art Students League in New York, which was an independent art school, which had been, the students had objected to the faculty, and they decided they threw out the faculty and ran the school themselves. And they decided who they would like to have as teachers. And Kirtland Cutter, young man, was educated under Carol Beckwith, though what he learned from him I have no idea. And then he went off and traveled in Europe. And we know that he was in Dresden, which of course is very much unlike anything you'd find in Ohio, as was Florence. But I have absolutely no documentation of anything that he did there. After that, he came back to the United States, and an uncle of him who lived in Spokane Falls, a small, unprepossessing town that had a magnificent waterfall in it, and he arrived here. His uncle worked in a bank and offered him a job working in the bank, but introduced him to rich people who needed houses. In his spare time, he did designs, and such as the one on the right, about which I know nothing, but talked some people into. There was one architect in Spokane, but he was rather old-fashioned. This is an early design by Kirtland Cutter, but on the right is a house by his rival, and this is in the French Second Empire style. It's tall and pretentious. And Cutter's first house that was actually built for F. Rockwood Moore on the South Hill in Spokane was quite different. It does look a little bit amateurish, but its irregularity was all part of the idea. This was a hill with great outcroppings of basalt upon it, some of them heaps 10 or 15 feet high, and a house built of rough rock, and looking as if he was thinking, he had been in England, he was thinking perhaps of old English houses that had been built over several centuries. Bits had been added and bits had been pulled down, so they were a bit of a mess, and this was the aesthetic that appealed to him. Oh, I'm going the wrong way. More sophisticated is this little funerary chapel in Fremont. This little cemetery chapel in Fairmont Cemetery, built of great chunks of basalt with a shingled roof. Surely Christians wanting to be buried appropriately would prefer something more classical or maybe medieval, but this is a response to the place, which was a very fine thing to do. And I think in this design he was influenced by a building that we talked about last week, the Ames Gate Lodge at 2 weeks ago, northeastern Massachusetts, by H.H. Richardson, with rough boulders dragged from the river. Very unarchitectural in most people's opinion. So Cutter was obviously familiar with that kind of idea, and he built a funerary chapel that really expresses the site and, he thought, the time that he lived in. He also had a commission to design a house for F. Lewis Clark on the South Hill, and began by building a lodge gate, which is in the same kind of rustic style. But he had an idea. Here's the site of it, and there's one of those piles of basalt, at least 15 feet high, and behind it what looks like this is the lower structure of a windmill that Cutter also built there. But on the right, you see his first design for the house, which would bridge onto the top of the pile of basalt. Quite a romantic idea. Here's the pile of basalt. Is this? Yeah, this is the pile of basalt, and there's the base of the windmill. Oh. Oh, shoot. You can't see that?
The pointer, we can't figure out the pointer. Is it on here? No. Is it on here?
We've got the... Oh, you...
There we go. Now you just bring it up or down wherever you need it.
Yes, okay, here's the pile of basalt, and there are outcroppings like this all over the South Hill, and in this case, what he wanted to do was to build a house next to it and bridge onto the top of it and have a little turret above it. Quite a romantic idea. Then he designed his own house on the South Hill, and since he had traveled in Switzerland when he was on his European trip, and he had studied Swiss chalets, he decided that this was what he wanted. It absolutely suitable for a hill with fir trees on it, and so this was what he built it in stages. This was the original design, but first he built rather less. Now, various Americans had done drawings suggesting Swiss chalets. There's Cutter's version on the left, and on the right, a couple of drawings in pattern books for houses, which are sort of prettified and weak. But Cutter really did something strong with broad overhanging eaves and big brackets under the eaves to keep it as it should be. There was one pattern book entitled Rural Architecture by P.F. Robinson in 1823 that really knew what it was talking about, and that was something that Cutter accepted, but he didn't need to look at this book. He had seen the real thing. And then his interiors were quite picturesque. There was a dining room that almost looks as if it's on a ship or something like that, a boat. And then the living room with a rustic masonry fireplace and another room with rustic stones for the fireplace and oriental carpets hanging from the ceiling, and maybe you can make out a suit of armor standing there, the sort of thing one needs to convey the right ancestry and lifestyle. And here he is standing outside his chalet with his second wife. So there were in Spokane a lot of mining millionaires, and he was ready to build houses for them, and I'm sure that he entertained in this house in a way that surprised them, but encouraged him. And so the first house, or one of the first houses that he built on the South Hill, was the Glover House, which has a half-timbered upper part. I looked through books that had been in his library when I was in the museum in Spokane. There on the right, you see a late Tudor house in England in one of the books, and I think this kind of thing spurred him on. Now, he does go back perhaps to colonial America for a simple architectural style on which he could elaborate. On the right is a house by McKim, Mead and White, built in 1887, about the same time, that takes the idea of the simple shingle house and expands it enormously and throws out a huge covered balcony on one side. So here is the Glover House again, with a couple of examples of houses that might have had some sort of influence. John Calvin Stevens did a design for a house by the sea. I'm not sure it was ever built. And down below, one by Norman Shaw, a Queen Anne revival house in England. So this house survives today. It's now used for various purposes. It's rented out for parties and so on. Everyone wants to live like the aristocrats of a previous generation, so they could do it for a day or two. The interior has a feature that was common in shingle-style houses the time of H.H. Richardson. They had what was called a living hall. There was a living room or a drawing room and a library and a dining room off it. But here was a room that was more theatrical. It had a staircase. This sort of design is great for a stage set because they have upstairs and downstairs. They have a staircase. People can pop out at various places and say something dramatic. And so you can imagine Mrs. Glover sweeping down these stairs in a fine dress that she's just received from Paris while her guests are gathered below. That was the idea of this kind of design. And then there's that niche under the stair. If you want to be a little cozy, you can sit on a seat in there or on a rocking chair. And then up above are passages leading to the bedrooms. Above this hall was a magnificent ceiling with a peacock and elaborate decoration. In 1889, Cutter built a house for James Wardner at a place that was then called Fairhaven. It's now part of Bellingham. And this, I think, followed some of the livelier houses in the shingle style or from that era. But it's got a bit of everything, you know. It's got a covered balcony, a turret, a gable roof, a narrow balcony that you can walk around on. So this would have been a lot of fun to live in. And maybe Cutter was inspired by this design by Peabody and Stearns, but Manchester by the Sea, built in 1882, which has some similar characteristics. What have I done? One thing I wanted to mention is that Frank Lloyd Wright's famous Roby House in Chicago has a huge covered balcony. The roof is of lower pitch, but this is the same sort of idea, and Cutter, I think, preceded Roby House with that. That's my habit. Sorry about that. And then here's a house in Tacoma, very, very steep roof with a little turret on one side. There's definitely a picturesqueness about it that he was definitely aiming at. In 1885, he was asked by Charles Conrad in Kalispell to design him a house. Charles Conrad had grown up in a wealthy family in the South, and then the Civil War had wrecked the family's fortunes, and he had taken a boat as far up as up the river as you could go from New Orleans, and then started traveling west. He was planning to head to Seattle, but he came to Kalispell, which has beautiful views of close by mountains, and he thought it was a wonderful place to live. And so he stopped here, and he asked for an architect, and people said, well, you've got to go to Spokane for the architect you need. And I can't think how far away they are, about 100 miles probably. And so he headed to Spokane, and he saw the Glover House and decided that something like that would do him well. And so this is, in a way, a version of the Glover House, similar ideas, covered with shingles, and the interior spaces are surprisingly similar. We'll see that when we get to them. But again, like that first stone house that we saw, he is sort of anchoring it to the ground. It's not one of those hoity-toity, tall Victorian houses. And then here is the interior. Does it look rather familiar? I think that's a bit naughty, repeating the same thing, but maybe his client said, I want one like that. But there is a difference, that when you get up the stairs, you get to the first landing, and there is the billiard room. I think that's a terrific idea. You're playing billiards all alone, and then someone comes down the stairs and says, can I join you? And he beats you hollow. But it's sociable. It's usually in houses of that era, the billiard room was downstairs or even in the basement at the back, and it was definitely a gentleman's domain, and maybe there were slightly risque pictures on the walls, who knows. So we have this same feature of the arch under the staircase. Why not repeat it? And from the kitchen area to the dining room, there's a pass-through in the form of a barrel. Not a bad idea, because the food would keep a little warmer in there than it might exposed to the atmosphere. And then upstairs, there's a passage leading to a number of bedrooms. Oh, thank you for asking. Did he do the stained glass? He loved elaborate glass, and he knew people on the East Coast who made it. He got things from Chicago and New York and other places. Well, then we come into the early 1890s, the time of the World's Columbian Exposition, which I showed you last time as the reason that American architects turned away from modern ideas. And he was commissioned by the state of Idaho to design the Idaho Building. Well, how would you express the character of Idaho? Idaho at the end of the 19th century. The rich people lived in so-called Queen Anne-style houses, which Queen Anne herself would not have recognized, and a lot of decorative stuff. But this was what Cutter decided expressed Idaho, and he was right. This is absolutely what was needed. The logs came from Idaho. Even the basalt rocks that were used for the base came from Idaho. And people flocked to it. And it won a prize for the state pavilion that best expressed its character. So this gave Cutter some recognition, and it led to a number of commissions for buildings in a rustic style, which is something that made him unusual. Most American architects were trying to be sophisticated, not rustic. So this was a magnificent structure. When the exhibition ended, somebody bought it and moved it to Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, where it was put up, and then eventually it began to collapse. It probably hadn't been very well rebuilt, and it was the wood was used to make a jetty going out into the lake. But somebody else wanted one too, and I just put this in for the idea of a rustic building. Thomas Cole, The Hunter's Return, which I think I saw in a museum in Fort Worth and was very happy to see. But here's an interior for the Idaho Building with great logs across the ceiling and rustic furniture. But some people in England wanted one too, and so they... I'm going to put something there to remind me what to push. So some people in England wanted to build a replica of it at Ringwood in Dorset. I went there and looked for it, but it had not gone. I've eventually found something in the library to say that it had been demolished recently. But there it was in a magnificent woodland setting, and I'm sure Cutter was very pleased to get that commission, and he actually went there and supervised the construction of it a bit. And since this lasted longer, we have more interiors from it. Pretty amazing with these great logs. These ones actually stripped of bark across the space inside. In that mode, he designed a church at Chelan, Washington. Has anyone seen that church? Yes. So Lake Chelan is a beautiful place. I've been up that lake all the way to Stehekin and camped there. But this church was, most churches were built to look as if they were built of stone, or at least with very tidy siding out of wood and Gothic windows and so on. But here he doesn't hold back, and this interior and the tower are unique and really do express something of Northwest possibilities. But that was not the sort of thing that most of Cutter's clients were thinking of. Here in Spokane, at the end of First Avenue in Brown's Addition, a whole series of houses in entirely different styles. But why would anyone want to have a house next door in the same style as their own? Failure. So Cutter could provide what was necessary. He could do a neoclassical house, or a Tudor house on the right, or between the two of them, something that is a little puzzling in the Northwest, a Californian Spanish revival, pseudo-Spanish house. And don't they look good together? You don't get confused as to which door to enter into when you go home. The Finch House has a grand ionic portico, a balcony outside, a bedroom upstairs, and a smaller balcony outside the principal bedroom looking into the portico. And then to one side of it, there's a carriage house in the same style. That's not included in the picture, but the Mission Revival House has its matching carriage house. I imagine there was also a dog house in the same style in the original time. So his clients could have their own distinctive home, not like the one next door. The Campbell House is next to the museum, the Cheney Coles Museum. Have some of you been to that museum? And the house next to it is now part of the museum, and so it's been furnished as much as possible with original furniture, at least from the period. Cutter clearly enjoyed the irregularities of Tudor houses and Tudoresque houses of the 19th century, and so he was in his element designing this. But as we've seen, he could build classical houses too. This one is on the South Hill. It's the Austin Corbin house. Austin Corbin's father was a banker, and he was a very grouchy old man. But his son Austin, who by chance Cutter had met in Switzerland on his European trip, and they'd become friends. And he then married Austin Corbin's sister. Cutter married his sister, but that didn't turn out very well. But the house did. And then the richest of all the mining millionaires in Spokane was Patrick Clark. He had worked his way, he had come from Ireland and worked his way across the country with spade and shovel, and he really knew how to run a mine. Originally, he became a mine manager for a wealthy family, and then he owned his own mines. And he was a special challenge. You really had to show that he was special, poor Irishman as he was. And so the Patrick Clark House in Brown's edition is a sort of extravaganza, and yet it does have a kind of coherence, and the elements belong together. They are just flamboyant in their way. And when we come inside, we find a gorgeous stained glass window at the top of the stairs and elaborate brackets between columns and beams above. I think his work was quite original. When I was working on the book on Cutter, I tried to find houses, I searched everywhere in books for houses that had similar features, and I think he did pretty well. Yes. Yes. There's a Muslim. What would you call that? A Grant, you can name that arch.
Are we looking at a Muqarnas?
No, I'm not thinking. I'm not thinking of him. I'm not thinking of him. This arch. I'm sure I knew a name for it. F. Lewis Clark, for whom he first designed a simple lodge. Later, he built the house. These houses were all in about 1896. This one is 1899 to 1900. again, he takes the Tudor idiom, but builds a wonderful, huge balcony off one of the upper rooms. There's perhaps the master bedroom, and this is a huge outdoor room, and there's another one underneath it. So the Tudors didn't have that kind of thing, but they could be offered to American clients at the end of the 19th century. And then here we are, about a couple of blocks from here, the Stimson greenhouse. I should walk around and get a better picture of it. And the Stimson greenhouse, I have to tell you, is somewhat similar to the Campbell house in Spokane. He gained, Stimson may have said, I like the Campbell house, do something like that. And there it is, and I'm sure you've all been there. I was at a reception there just a few weeks ago for the Washington Trust for Historic Preservation. And we were drinking wine and eating tasty snacks in those very rooms. There's an original picture of the living, looking from the library into a gallery, and the family used to perform plays here, so that was their stage. And then, completely different style, the ladies' reception room is much more delicate, as you'll see. Not far away on Capitol Hill is the People's House. P-E-E-P, what's it? No, it's People's with two E's. Oh, he did a house for them somewhere else in Spokane too. So he's returned to the Swiss chalet motif. That one, I've walked by it a few times and once knocked on the door. Now, Louis Davenport was an absolutely amazing restaurateur and hotelier in Spokane, who came with $5 in his pocket to Spokane, helped to clean up after the fire, which helped Cutter have lots of clients who needed new buildings because they'd all burnt down. Davenport opened a restaurant in a tent. Then he opened a small restaurant that I'll show you later, and then was ready to build this grand house on the South Hill. Unfortunately, it doesn't exist anymore. And it was the sort of house that needed a gatehouse. And there's the gatehouse. He was planning to build a windmill, but people complained that the sails turning would frighten the horses going along the street. So he just built the tower of a windmill. One of his grandest houses near Seattle is Thornwood, which is just south of Tacoma. Has anyone seen that? Ah. Was that your house? It's been converted into apartments, and I think there are little houses in the grounds. But you can, if you look at the plan, you will see something that was very characteristic of Cutter's work. You don't just build a square box and divide it into smaller boxes. It juggles around and bits stick out this way and that, and it gives it much more light and shade as you look at the exterior and variety inside. There's a very nice sort of garden room covered from the weather, but open through huge arches to the garden, and the top of that is a great terrace outside one of the bedrooms. So this is was one of the grandest houses that Cutter managed to design, and I can imagine the fun that he had with it. He actually imported the bricks from England from a demolished house. Thank God they used weak mortar in those days. And the staircase and the doors and other features came from England around Cape Horn. Another house near there in Tacoma, a more relaxed stone house, again has similar characteristics, irregular and full of incident. I have on the left a picture that I took of a thatched house in Devonshire in England, and that was his motif for a house in Metallide Falls up in the northeast part of the state, the Lewis Larson house. But up in the highlands in Seattle, he did a grand house for the Stimpsons. As he had started with the Stimpson house, the one near us, and the city had moved towards it, and they felt a bit overwhelmed, so they needed a new house up in the highlands with a great courtyard, an arcaded courtyard, where he put into use something that he had discovered in Florence. It looks like the arcade in the Piazza Santissima Annunziata in Florence. And then, for Louis Davenport, he designed Davenport's restaurant, which was known as the Italian Gardens, and next to it, a hotel, the Pennington Hotel, in a similar kind of style. And inside, an exciting bar with some amazing sort of Art Nouveau motifs. A small room called the Peacock Room, no longer there, I'm afraid. And then the Hall of the Doges, which was upstairs. And he had been to Venice. We actually have an oil paint somewhere in Spokane in a bank. There's an oil painting by him that he claimed to have painted in Venice. So he must have known what he was doing. This has a central space that could be used for dancing, and then aisles all the way around it with tables, a very good arrangement for a room of this type. And so that is the Hall of the Doges. When the hotel was renovated, they tore down the Italian Gardens and the Pennington Hotel, but they wrapped this up in a box and hoisted it out with a crane, and it's been put back somewhere. So there is the source, the Doge's Palace in Venice. Then here's Louis Davenport's private apartment and the Pennington Hotel. And then we get to the Davenport Hotel. Oh, in the cartoon. That's him on this tower. Cutter. So his first design was a bit flamboyant, with these elaborate towers that provided no food or lodging. And so Cutter and Davenport went to New York and Chicago and a few other places and looked at hotels. And after that, he developed a more rational design. It has its elaborate features like these ram's heads on the above the second floor. And here is the interior. When I first saw it, the hotel was really run down, and this certainly didn't look anything like this. The bedrooms were very boring and so on. But Cutter made this into the living room of Spokane. Everything happened here. There were conventions here. I've seen pictures of it used in all kinds of different ways, and that was a major feature of Spokane. Then he designed the life insurance building that you see here, in which he put his office. So it was the Western Union Life Insurance Building. But when you entered that life insurance building, you first went into a large brick-lined room with a big fireplace, trying to make you feel at home. And there he tried to feel at home in his own office too. And now we're on familiar ground. Here's the Rainier Club in Seattle. And he probably, I found this picture in a book that was retained from his library, an old hall in 17th century house in Warwickshire. The Spokane Club was of a different grand style, and here the wealthy of Spokane would meet. I once knew someone wealthy enough to invite me to spend a night there in one of their comfortable bedrooms. Well, I'm getting a little short of time, so I've got some very important stuff coming up. Lake McDonald Lodge in the Glacier National Park, which really gave him an opportunity for his rustic desires. It's right by the lake with steps leading up to it from the lake, has balconies all the way around the outside, and then an interior with whole tree trunks with the bark still on and similar small branches making the balustrades. Now, the national park buildings are something unique to America, and Cutter was one of the first people to do this type of architecture. So I think that he deserves a role in the architecture of the country. Here you can see a space, the central space, which is arranged a bit like the Hall of the Doges. Around the edge were places with tables for patrons to sit while there could be dancing in the middle. So I'm showing you the same space with the Hall of the Doges. And there's a wonderful staircase in Lake McDonald Lodge also, and a fireplace with great stones. It still has an iron cauldron hanging on a chain above the flames. The gate at Camp Lewis, which is near here, between here and Tacoma, was designed by him with cobblestone, big round stones on the base and wood up above. I think he really got the idea of a military establishment as it should be. And Kootenai Lodge at Swan Lake near Kalispell, Montana. This was a private house, a summer house for someone who had a mansion outside New York, a 90-room mansion outside New York, and he wanted a place that he could invite his guests to in the summer. He had his own train. His butler would come with fine crystal glass and porcelain and silver, and they would serve meals in fine style in this interior. This was the time when wealthy people built their houses in the Adirondacks, and it was the same sort of idea. But look at that fireplace with the balcony above. So this was something that he did that few other architects were involved with. And there's a wonderful construction. If you want to exaggerate the power of the structure, there's a way to do it. Well, when the Depression came, he was running out of wealthy clients in Spokane, and he decided he was given an invitation. He was told to design a city in California, which sounded a pretty good deal. So he headed to Palos Verdes, which is near Los Angeles on the coast, a beautiful area. And he designed this town center, which never was quite built like that. Just a little bit of it was built, but he built many houses there. And he was asked to do a sort of drawing showing how the houses could be distributed on the hillside there. He wanted something informal and romantic. And quite soon he got one commission from the Cameron family in 1924. And these are some of the preliminary sketches that he made, and more. And there's a view of the Cameron house from above. And when I was helping to make the film about Cutter, and I was invited to go with him to California, we had lunch with the Camerons, well, no, the present owners in their courtyard. And and they said, "Oh, if you're going to come and work on the book here, why don't you stay with us? We have a guest house." Architecture historians don't always have that amount of luck. Perhaps Grant has had it often, but not me. So that was very delightful. But now, instead of looking at something grandiose, copying, glorying in past styles, he's trying to find an architecture that suits the land and the culture. He was not the first to introduce a sort of Spanish revival type of house in California, but he was in the forefront, and he won prizes in the region for his homes, which were really delightful. I'll have to run very quickly through just a few of them. In this one you see one of the characteristics, a shady, arcaded walk beside the house, sometimes elaborate structures exploiting wood in the interior, and so on. I visited many houses there, and I had a really good time visiting them, and it added a new dimension to the book, because it showed that he could go from being completely eclectic, as I said, what was the word I used? Promiscuously using architectural styles, to trying to settle buildings into a landscape in a more reasonable way. So that is Kirtland Cutter. I was going to try and slip in a little bit of Julia Morgan. Well, perhaps I'll just show a few pictures to show what I was talking about. Julia Morgan was about 12 years younger than Cutter, and she went to the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. She was the first woman to attend the Beaux-Arts, and you probably know something that she designed. She was the architect of Hearst Castle, and at the Beaux-Arts she would have learned all kinds of principles that she could employ in building, creating the plan and the massing of a house like this, that isn't just a sort of complete copycat affair. Beautifully done. I'm sure I've been there. Have any of you? I'm sure some of you have been there. But and there's the outdoor swimming pool. in a Roman manner. But Julia Morgan built much simpler buildings, 700 buildings. She built YMCAs, YWCAs, women's clubs, churches, all kinds of things. And I just scanned a few pictures from a book, and this is really all I have. There is one of her YMCAs, YWCAs, which you can see has a glorious character. There's a courtyard in it. She didn't get the Beaux-Arts disease in Paris. She became a much more liberal thinker and designed many beautiful buildings, 700 of them. So that's that. I've taken too much time. But does anyone have any questions or comments? Yes, at the back there.
Oh, I'm supposed to be doing that.
You're
We in Spokane say Spokane, just to tell you that.
what did I say?
I grew up in Spokane, and we love Cutter. And when the Davenport Hotel went downhill, they gave away and sold a whole lot of their furnishings. Then when it was renovated, they bought a lot of that back because it was so wonderful. And my high school reunion was the first group to use the new Davenport Hotel. I love the buildings.
Wonderful. Over there.
Henry, do you know, is the Patsy Clark home still a restaurant? I had dinner there about 20 years ago, but
No,
I haven't been back.
It was a restaurant for a while, and I had dinner there a couple of times. But it later became a law office. I don't know if you could trust a lawyer who lived in a building that looked like that. Yes.
I talked to my relatives in Spokane this morning, and apparently Patsy Clark, there are some places where you can still have private dining and so forth and meetings. So maybe the lawyers do that. I don't know. And the Glover House is just right up from downtown, and it's right next to the Unitarian Church that they call it, which is really quite modern. But the Glover House is not, and I must have gone to many, many receptions there, weddings and so forth. So it's quite used all the time. No, the Glover House is in Spokane. And the Campbell House was originally the museum for Spokane, and then they built the new Cheney Coles next to that.
Yeah, when I first went there, actually, you go upstairs, and some of the bedrooms looked like bedrooms, and some of them had piles of exhibits in them. Grant has something to say.
Grant, this is definitely far from modernism.
I was just wondering, was it Bevan Gould who made the addition to the Rainier Club?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, copying almost exactly Cutter's theme, as I think. Is that true?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I think it's very. You don't quite know where one begins and the other.
Yes, exactly. Very
So
smooth
Bev-
transition. Yeah.
Bebb and Gould. Bebb was the local supervisor of the construction of the Stimson House, I think. Maybe not. I'll have to read my book to find out. Yes. Oh. Go ahead, Bob. It goes up.
On?
It's on. Those very fine renderings and watercolors and so forth, the presentations. Did he do his own or a lot of them?
He did do quite a lot of renderings to show to clients, but when he started, he was a very poor draftsman. And then he got all kinds of people to do that for him. A number of draftsmen who became independent architects. Some of them resented Cutter because they claimed that he took the credit for everything they did. But that's not the only time that's happened with architects, perhaps. Yes, Bill. Bill's hand is up.
I noticed when he built his chalet that he put rocks on the roof. Was that purely for aesthetics, or was he really trying to keep the shingles from blowing off?
Well, in answer to that question, one of the pattern books that had a version of a chalet, it had a rather decorative chalet, and the author said, you don't have to use the lower floor as a stable for cows and put rocks on the roof. They put the rocks on the roof to hold the roof down. You know, sometimes you get high winds.
In Switzerland.
So,
But the thing is, it's not only the wind that breaks up the snow, so the snow doesn't slide off the roof all at one whack.
Can you all hear?
Yeah, we have an architect with an answer.
But they do it now for decorations.
Any more questions or observations?
Okay, I guess we're out of time.
Thank you very much.